Jeremiah doesn't just say, settle into the place and begin to look like the place. Notice he's not just talking about assimilation. That's not the idea. He's not saying blend in to the place at your place, fit in with all of the people that you're around, give in to all of their way of life. In fact, he explicitly is not saying that. He says, build a house in a Babylonian neighborhood. Plant gardens that aren't just a drain on the Babylonian economy, contribute to the Babylonian economy. But he also invites these people to stay unique, settle down and stay unique. If you got a Bible today, would you grab it and meet me in Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah chapter 29 is where we're going to be today. We've continued to look through the life and the leadership of a guy named Jeremiah because in a lot of ways, Jeremiah shows us what it looks like to live and to lead in the middle of a culture gone bad and a world gone bad, and to live for good with a capital G. Shows us how to live in a world like this without sacrificing yourself or your soul. Even when you don't have a power or a platform, even when you don't feel like you've got a voice. And I've told you all along the way, Jeremiah lived during what historians tell us is probably one of the most volatile times in all of world history. Just during his lifetime and over the course of his writing this book, you see the demise of the Assyrian Empire. He saw it in his day. And the rise of the Babylonian Empire in his day. And the decay and the ultimate collapse of his own country. He saw all of it in the middle of his day. And I don't want to put too fine a point on it because the situations are really, really different. But as you watch the news and you see all of the world events that we've seen play out over the last few days, watching an evil power flex its muscles and taunt the world just because it can, starts to give you a little bit of a sense what the nation of Israel had been watching for a really long time. And they knew the Babylonians weren't just going to stay over there. They weren't going to just stay in the distance. Their hunger wasn't going to be satisfied until there was nothing more for them to eat. By the end of the book, the people of God are living in exile. Home was a long way from home. And Jeremiah wrote this book right smack in the middle of a world like that. And what you find is the letter is both a rebuke to the people of God and it's a roadmap for their hope. The rebuke's clearest in chapter 2. God says to his people, the reason that you're hopeless isn't that the world is hostile. And the world's been hostile for a really, really long time. The reason that you're hopeless is not that you're hostile, or not that the world's hostile. The reason that you're hopeless is that your heart is hollow. In fact, he says that explicitly. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. God says, my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. It's actually a pretty poignant picture if you think about it. Rather than trusting God to show up and to provide for them in an ongoing way, when the rest of the world started to get badder and badder, they started to freak out and panic. They started building containers, so to speak, digging cisterns so that they could protect what God had provided for them in the past and not have to trust him to show up today or tomorrow. They become so obsessed with protecting what God had provided in the past, they stopped trusting him to provide in the present. And by the time they finally realized that their cisterns were leaking, they'd forgotten where to go to find hope and to fill them up. And they had nobody to blame but themselves. But the book isn't just written as a rebuke to the people of God. It's also written as a roadmap for their hope. It's an example of how people who don't have a platform, who don't have political power, who aren't popular, who don't feel like they've got a voice, are often in perfect position for God to bring good to a world gone bad. Last week we saw the answer is not just to grab boxing gloves for combat with the culture, or to grab rubber gloves for isolation from the culture. It's to put on a pair of gardening gloves and join God in his work of cultivation, even in a world gone bad. Last week we looked at Jeremiah 9 and we saw what it is that God expects us to be about. Today I want to look at Jeremiah 29 as God tells his people what it looks like to be about it. In fact, last night I was reading this great story about the French composer Olivier Messiaen. He wrote a famous 20th century piece called The Quartet for the End of the World. Some of you familiar with that piece? The story behind the piece is that Messiaen wrote this piece in a concentration camp. He was taken captive by the Nazis, and he was put in a concentration camp, 1941, in Germany in the dead of winter. And yet, Messiaen himself was a Christ follower and found himself reading the four Gospels and reading the book of Revelation there in the camp. And he found himself filled with hope for the world, even while he lived there in hell on earth. And when he discovered there were 3 other musicians in the camp with him, he started searching for instruments, and he found a cello that only had a string that was missing, found a beat-up violin, a marginally functional clarinet, and a piano which the keys stuck together. And he set about writing a piece for broken instruments. And he pulled all of those musicians together, and they played it for the very first time in the month of January, excruciatingly cold, playing a piece that was written for broken instruments under horrific circumstances. And he composed a piece that the New Yorker magazine would later call the most beautiful piece of music written in the 20th century. For the rest of his life, Messiaen would say it was his best work. And the prisoners and the guards would say they never again experienced such beauty in the world as they did that excruciatingly cold day, living in hell on earth, listening to music composed on broken instruments. Sort of brings us to the question that we have today: how do you create a taste of heaven in a world that so often looks like hell? And it's really what Jeremiah shows us. Jeremiah chapter 29. It's what God invites the people of God to. Look at Jeremiah chapter 29, beginning in verse 1. It says, "This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests and the prophets and all the other people that Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Hey, so something I think is interesting to point out here. I told you, things have been slowly going bad in Jerusalem and all around Jerusalem for a while at this point. The political leaders were corrupt, the religious leaders couldn't be trusted, and big bad Babylon kept getting closer and closer and closer. And actually, they conquered Israel in slow motion. There were 3 waves of exiles that left. The first time that Babylon came knocking on the door, they came for the young and the hopeful. They came for the valedictorians and the high school quarterbacks and the National Honor Society. They came and took the best and the brightest from the young, and they carried them away. You remember the story of Daniel and his friends, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. They went as a part of that captivity, that movement of exile, as Babylon took the first wave of people captive. But then Babylon came back, and after they'd taken away the young, they came for the influencers. All of the people that had leadership, the architects, the culture makers, the entrepreneurs, the business people, the priests, and the prophets, the people that had a platform, the people that had influence, they carried them away. And they took them to Babylon. They had a strategy. They were going to give them great jobs. They were going to give them a great life. They would give them as much money as they wanted. Introduce them to the Babylonian way of life. More power, more education, more resources, better cisterns, right? And the reasoning was that if they carried them all that way, then they would never want to go back home. They'd never rebel. They'd never leave. Then they could just install a puppet king back in Israel. And the rest of the people who were left would simply be sheep who would just follow wherever the puppet king told them to go. It's really a brilliant strategy for conquering a place, is it not? Go for the young first, then go for the influencers. Everybody else will follow like sheep. I say all of that to point out where Jeremiah is when he writes this letter. Did you notice it, Jeremiah 29, verse 1? This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from where? From Jerusalem. To the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests and the prophets and all the other people. Jeremiah goes on to name everybody else, the influencers, the skilled artisans, the skilled workers, the cultural elite. They'd already been taken captive at this point. And where's Jeremiah? He's still back in Jerusalem. He'd been ignored by the people for so long. He'd had so little influence for so long that even the Babylonians thought he wasn't a person worth taking when they took the influential and the powerful. No platform, no power, no voice, just a guy in perfect position for God to use. And right off the bat, Jeremiah is saying, from all of the nobodies like me, all the way up to the elders and the priests and the prophets and all of the other somebodies, when you find yourself in a fractured, polarized, politicized, dangerous, and destructive world, even when you have the minority voice, and you feel like you're trying to catch a cultural boulder that's already started down the mountain, this is the way that God invites you to live. Look what he tells them, beginning in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry, have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Don't decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Okay, I was paying a little attention to the reading there, so I didn't hear anybody gasp in the middle of that. But I'm sure maybe you did. I was sort of ready for somebody at some point to kind of interrupt that and go, you got to be kidding me. Maybe a small riot to break out, somebody to get up and storm out of the auditorium. I didn't see any. Did that happen? That certainly would have happened the first time this letter was read. Jeremiah handed the letter to 3 people and had them carry it to Babylon. When he began to read this, they read it to the people that were camped in tents on the outskirts of Babylon, where they'd spent all of their time doing 2 things: complaining about the government where they were and waiting for it to all blow over. And in fact, there were at least 3 religious leaders that all get named throughout the book of Jeremiah who had decided to take the moment to seize a little power for themselves and a little money on the side for themselves, the exact same way that leaders tend to do it today, by appealing to 2 things for the people that were settled as exiles: to appealing to their anxiety and appealing to their sentimentality. Keeping the people angry and anxious in the present, while keeping their eyes focused on how great the past used to be, while making campaign promises about how quickly they could solve the problems if the people would just follow them. In fact, Jeremiah's letter is sandwiched right between 2 such campaign promises, where 2 different ones of those leaders said, if you'll just follow us, if you'll just trust us, we can fix this, give us 2 years. And right in the middle of it, God speaks to Jeremiah and says, it's not going to be 2 years. It's going to be 70 years. And yet, here's how I want my people to live, even when they're living in a world gone bad for a really long time. He gives them 3 things. Look at them really quickly. The first thing he tells them is this. If you're taking notes, you want to write this down. He tells them to settle down, which is everybody's favorite thing to hear when they're stirred up, right? Little marital advice: when you're in the middle of a fight, calm down is not the right thing to say. And when people are stirred up and angry, settle down is not what they want to hear. You can hear the people of Israel hearing this letter being read saying, settle down. You are out of your mind, settle down. I mean, do you see what's happening in the world? You see what's happening in our world? Do you see our futures, our finances, our fortunes, our freedoms? They're all circling the drain right now. Settle down is the worst thing we can do. And actually, when Jeremiah says the word settle down, he means it two ways, doesn't he? One is the way that we're talking about. Verse 4, he says, God carried you here. You thought you were the victim of circumstances in the world around you. You're not. You thought you were just the victim of the hands of power-hungry political leaders. You're not. It's not just the enemies that are threatening to overwhelm you and carry you away. Come on, they are not that powerful. God says, I am the Lord God Almighty. Almighty. Present world circumstances have not affected my plan. Not my plan for the world, and not my plan for you in the world. In fact, that's how Jeremiah ends the letter, isn't it? Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, it's a familiar passage to many of us. We thought it was about a graduation, high school graduation or a new baby or a wedding. It's not. It's written to a community of people who find themselves living in a world that more often feels like hell than heaven, who wonder if God is losing his grip on the world he's created. And Jeremiah writes to people stuck right in the middle of that to say, no, here's what God says. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They're plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future, even in a world when you wonder. So take a deep breath. Settle down. God's still on his throne. Jeremiah also means it literally, doesn't he? He says, build houses, plant gardens, and plan to eat the fruit of the gardens that you planted. Literally, drop roots here. Stay like you're staying for good. What does it look like to stay like you're staying for good? Well, think maybe about the difference between a hotel and a home. I mean, I've stayed in maybe dozens of hotel rooms over the course of my life. I don't know about you and what you do in hotel rooms. I have never, ever, ever touched up paint in a hotel room. Never. I've never done any fixture repairs or replacement in a hotel room. Never hung new artwork on the wall. I've never redecorated a hotel where I stayed. If something needed fixed, I do one of two things. I either ignore it and wait for me to go away, or I call somebody else and make it their problem. But I don't go to work because I'm not planning to stay. Home's different. Whether I'm renting the home or I own the home, I treat the home differently. When I'm planning to stay, I get to know the place that I'm staying, the ins and out of it. I own its problems, and I own their solutions because I'm planning to stay, and I'm invested in its future. That's what God's saying right here to these people. Stay like you're staying here. Not that it's a sin to move. Not that it's wrong to move away someday or to leave a place that you've been placed. But until the day that God places you someplace else, live in the place that you live like you're staying. Because even if you don't stay forever, when you live that way, your contributions will endure. The house that you built, the plants that you plant, the produce those plants produce, the people that you influence, they'll stay. Even if you go, if you stay where you're at like you're staying, for good. That's why as a church, Fort Worth for Good, we're so invested in neighboring. Living and leading towards a day where every single person in Fort Worth has someone, and Lord willing, a group of people who literally love their neighbors, who love God with all their heart, all their mind, all their soul, who love each other and who sacrificially love the people near them and live near them towards good with a capital G. That's why we're planting that congregation in Alliance. That's why when we see a challenge in a local elementary school, we own the problem and the solution when we're equipped to address it. We don't see it as a cost. We see it as an investment. That's why we'd eliminate debt as a church, to free up resources in perpetuity, not just as a part of a 2-year vision, but on and on and on, to be able to invest the margin that we create towards a vision of staying here for good and for the good of the place that we're placed. We're committed to staying in this city and to staying in this city for its good. It's part of settling down. Notice, Jeremiah doesn't just say, settle into the place and begin to look like the place. Notice he's not just talking about assimilation. That's not the idea. He's not saying blend in to the place that you're placed. Fit in with all of the people that you're around. Give in to all of their way of life. In fact, he explicitly is not saying that. He says, build a house in a Babylonian neighborhood. Plant gardens that aren't just a drain on the Babylonian economy. Contribute to the Babylonian economy. But he also invites these people to stay unique. Settle down and stay unique. He says, don't just become really well-behaved Babylonians. Don't give up hope, but don't punt the future either. Start families, he says. Become parents, raise kids, have lots of grandkids. Don't isolate from the culture. Stay distinct in the culture. Don't give up your identity. Don't decrease, increase. See to it that in 70 years, when you go back, when you're restored to your land, you don't go back as Babylonians who have the same DNA as people who used to follow God. We talked about this a little bit last week. We can't settle for the same broken cisterns that our world tries to find life in. If you have wisdom or intellect, it's one of those cisterns. Education, right? Don't just use it to circle the wagons. Don't just use it to win all the arguments. Leverage what you know for the good of the place that you're placed. If you find yourself with riches, for heaven's sake, enjoy them. But don't just hoard them. Don't find your identity or glory in your riches. Put your riches to work for good with a capital G. If you've got strength or influence or a platform or power, be willing to lend it to people that need it, even if just to borrow it for a period of time, to grow and to gain the strength that they need to stand on their own. Be known as people. That's what Jeremiah is saying. Stand out as people who are willing to get their hands dirty and go the distance, to provide support and structure that allow the young and the vulnerable and the delicate to thrive and flourish. People of humanity and humility that don't panic or puff up, but are patient on God to show up, even when life doesn't go their way. Settle in and stay unique, not in a rubber glove kind of way, in a winsome, compelling, attractive kind of way. You want a really good example of this? I don't know why it took so long. This week, the ice storm finally allowed the Freelands to hop on the Encanto train. Seen Encanto? Okay, so no spoilers if you haven't had a chance to see Encanto yet. But here's the storyline. There's this family that finds themselves in the middle of a community, and they receive a gift. Actually, the gift of miraculous uniqueness together as a family that reveals itself in individual uniquenesses and giftedness. And the thing is, the whole community knows that the Madrigals are different. They're unique, but not in a way that's off-putting. You don't ever get the sense that the Madrigal family feels like they're better than the community around them. In fact, on the other hand, they feel responsible for the community around them because of their uniqueness and their giftedness. And in fact, their greatest fear is that if they don't keep their uniqueness, it will endanger the community around them. Now, come on, that'll preach, Disney. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about Bruno. But I think the moral of the story seems to be the same as the moral of Jeremiah's life and leadership. Sometimes the most spectacular gifts aren't the most significant gifts to us or to the place that we're placed. When normal people with normal uniqueness deploy that uniqueness for good with a capital G, a whole community can flourish. That's the idea. The last thing you see is that. Seek flourishing. Seek flourishing. For each other, right? Like seek flourishing for insiders, for people that think like us and follow God like us, with the same ideologies as us, people that vote like us, behave like us, believe like us. Well, no, God assumes that we'll do that. But he lifts our eyes beyond it. He says, seek the peace of the city. What city? Here it's Babylon. He says, seek its peace. It's a Hebrew word, shalom, which doesn't just mean the absence of war. It means the presence of flourishing. Universal flourishing in every dimension, socially, relationally, economically, physically, aesthetically, spiritually, the way life, all of life was intended to function, with God right smack at the middle of it. Good with a capital G. God says, I want you to want that for the city where I've placed you. Because as the city prospers, you're going to prosper too. Why? Why will you prosper? Do you see that? Not just because doing the right thing to do gets rewarded by God for behaving yourself. It's not the idea. It's not what God's going for there. The idea is priorities like those require a connection with Him. And a life lived with Him is the only way to live. It's the only kind of life that doesn't ultimately die. The only kind of cistern that holds any water. Living for good isn't just the right thing to do. It's the best way to live. And put all of that together, let me give you a picture. I don't know for sure how you know when you're in a midlife crisis, but I've recently found myself trying to time my time at Costco around meal times so that I don't have to go to a restaurant and pay for meals. I can just take a couple of laps around Costco and accomplish it. I feel like maybe that's a clue to a moment like this, that I'm suddenly becoming my father. But I want you to think about that for maybe just a second, because I think Costco maybe provides a perfect picture of what Jeremiah is inviting people like us into these days. Here's the thing about Costco. Strategically placed all around the room, you've got these people who were sent into the store with a job. And everywhere you go, chances are there's one right near you. And they don't hassle you. I love that about them. They don't shame you. They don't force feed you their sample. They just announce what it is and offer you a taste. A taste of something that you may or may not have known that you've always been looking for. And if you like it, you can buy an economy-sized helping with more of that thing than you can possibly handle for yourself or your family. That's Jeremiah 29. That's the invitation of God to His people, to be people who offer samples of the kingdom everywhere we're strategically placed. For our home to be like a little free sample stand, where smells of the kingdom begin to drift over to the people that live near us, where we humbly, selflessly, attractively, patiently, winsomely put samples of goodness and justice and humility, righteousness on display wherever we're found, and inviting the people that we find ourselves near to experience a sample of life that can't be found in broken cisterns, but it's found in connection with a God who in Christ promises you as much of it as you could possibly handle. Would you pray with me? Lord, would you let us find our life in you? In fact, I pray specifically, Lord, for the person who has shown up today trying to grab life on their own or protect life on their own or get life back on their own apart from you, that they would find that you are the one through whom streams of living water come. That they would understand that Jesus came to the earth to live the life that we were designed to live and have walked away from. And that even when we find ourselves without hope, that He offers it to us. a connection with you, where streams of living water can flow within us and out of us into the place that you send us. And Lord, for those of us who are connected with you, I pray that that would be our story, that we would live in the world where you've sent us like we're sent here to stay, that we would trust in you. Lord, you've got this world under control, even when it feels like you don't. You would allow us to be people who calmly announce samples of the kingdom that are available in our home, in our office, in our school, in our hobbies, in the place that we find ourselves all throughout the week, winsomely, attractively, patiently, offering humility, grace, righteousness, justice, and mercy to the people we're near, so that the world around us, Lord, could get a taste of something that's better than life, even in a world that feels an awful lot like hell. Would you lead us to live this way, Lord, in Jesus' name? Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.